Welcome to another installment of Ember. It is my pleasure to introduce to you Dr. Jennifer Morse. Dr. Morse was a campaign spokeswoman for California's winning Proposition 8 campaign, which defined marriage as the union of a man and a woman. She has authored and co-authored 6 books and spoken around the globe. Her work has been translated into over 5 languages. Her latest book is The Sexual State: How Elite Ideologies Are Destroying Lives and Why the Church Was Right All Along. Dr. Morse is also the founder of the Ruth Institute, which is a global nonprofit organization that equips Christians to defend the family and build a civilization of love. She earned her PhD at the University of Rochester and taught economics at Yale and George Mason universities. She was named one of the Catholic Stars of 2013 and on a list that included both Pope Francis and Pope Benedict XVI. Dr. Morse and her husband are parents of an adopted child, a birth child, a goddaughter, and were foster parents for San Diego County to 8 foster children. In 2015, Dr. Morse and her husband relocated to Lake Charles, Louisiana, where the work of the Ruth Institute continues. Lastly, tonight's talk will be the case for Catholic sexual morality. And as we do with all things, let us begin in opening prayer. In the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Amen. Remember, O most gracious Virgin Mary, that never was it known that anyone who fled to your protection, implored your help, or sought your intercession was left unaided. Inspired by his confidence, I fly unto you, O Virgin of Virgins, my Mother. To you do I come, before you I stand, sinful and sorrowful. O Mother of the Word incarnate, despise not my petitions, but in your mercy, hear and answer me. Amen. Please welcome Dr. Jennifer Morse.
All right, everyone, welcome to this talk, and I'm delighted to be here and delighted to share with you the case for traditional Catholic sexual morality. For your information, this is being recorded in July of 2019, so you have some reference point for what I'm about to say. I have 4 important points that I want to discuss with you tonight. Number one is how Catholic sexual morality protects the rights of children. Secondly, I want to help you understand the sexual revolution and how the sexual revolution has affected children. Third, I'd like to cover the guilty conscience problem, what I call the guilty conscience problem, and you will see that this is a central part of dealing with these issues of sexual morality. And then finally, I want to close with the word of what will our legacy be. So let's dive right in for the case of defending Catholic traditional morality, how Catholic sexual morality protects the rights of children. Now, to understand this question, we have to ask ourselves, what is owed to children? What, if anything, do we owe to children? Now, on the screen, I have an image of children in a low-maintenance orphanage in Romania. And these children, as you can see, were not very well cared for. All right, so I ask you this question: do we owe children more than mere survival? Which is pretty much what these kids had, was they were just basically physically hanging on. And if we owe something to children, what is it that we owe children? Well, I would say that we owe 2 major things to children. Number one, we owe children a sense of identity. That is, every person has a right to know his or her genetic identity and cultural heritage. And when I say this is a right of children, think about it. Every single person gets onto this planet as a child. So that means it's not just a right of a child, it's the right of everybody. It's the right of every adult human person. You as an adult, anyone listening to this, has the right to know who they are and where they came from. Secondly, children have the right to relationship. That is, every child has a right to a relationship with their natural mother and father, except for an unavoidable tragedy. Now, as was mentioned in my bio, I'm an adoptive mother. I was a foster mother. So I'm well aware that sometimes unavoidable tragedies take place that prevent the natural parent from being there for the child. I'm well aware of that, and the church is well aware of that. As an adoptive mother, as a foster mother, I can tell you for sure The best thing for the child would have been if none of these bad things had happened to them, such that they had to end up in my house. In other words, we were good parents, good adoptive parents, good foster parents, but what the kids want, what the kids need, is to be with their mom and dad. So that is why we put so much emphasis on this point, that except for a truly unavoidable tragedy, everyone, every child, has a right to relationship with their natural mother and father. So now, if this is true, if you accept that children have some rights and you accept that these are important rights, how can we secure these rights for children? Well, there are two things we got to do. First, the parents need to make a plan to cooperate with each other for a lifetime. Now, why do I emphasize that? The mother and the father need to make a plan to cooperate with one another for a lifetime. Why? Because if mom and dad no longer have any kind of relationship or connection with each other, that means Junior will not be able to be in relationship with one of those parents. And many of you have probably observed this kind of situation where there's family breakdown of some kind or another. The parents don't live in the same house. They don't live in the same neighborhood. They might live in different states. In the summertime, you will see children on airplanes by themselves flying across the country to visit their non-custodial parent, right? So the fact that mom and dad are no longer in a relationship with each other is hindering the child's ability to be in relationship with at least one of them, and sometimes both. So to put this in negative terms, there are certain things that we need to not do. First, we need to not be having sex outside of marriage or before marriage. Second, no divorce without cause. And I'm fed up with you is not a cause, if I may say so. Third, no petty criticism of your spouse. This is always an important part of Catholic sexual morality, is that you're supposed to be nice to your spouse. It doesn't usually show up in the same point in the catechism, but in fact, it's very important, right? And finally, and this is a modern thing that we have to say now, no third-party reproduction. And when I say third-party reproduction, what I'm referring to is when a situation where people purchase an egg or they purchase sperm, and they use that to create a child with one of the people who are going to act as legal parent to the child, all right? That means that the person that you bought the egg from or the person you bought the sperm from, that person is not part of the child's life. So you have severed that relationship between the child and one of their natural parents. So no third-party reproduction if we're going to ensure that children have a right to their natural parents, to a relationship with both parents. Or we could turn this around and put it all in positive terms instead of in negative terms. You know, the church sometimes is all about no. You're not allowed to do this, you're not allowed to do that, blah, 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 blah. Back in the day, when I was a little girl, we always knew where the church stood on every question. The answer was no. We don't know what the question is, but the answer is no. Okay? That's the reputation that the church had. And we have moved away from that reputation by emphasizing the positive things. What is it that all these no's are protecting? What positive good are we protecting? So let's put this in positive terms. The lifelong cooperation plan between the husband and wife, the mother and father, is to get married before you have sex. Only have sex with your spouse. Stay married unless somebody does something really awful. And be nice to your spouse. These are the positive things that we're supposed to do as part of traditional Catholic sexual morality. In other words, traditional Christian sexual morality says get married for life, as Jesus would have put it. Well, I don't think he put it quite this way, but one to a customer for life, I think, is approximate interpretation of Matthew 19. Right? So in other words, if we look at it from the perspective of children's rights, and we start from the child's perspective, and we ask, what is owed to the child? And we reason outward from that, we think logically, what does it take to guarantee the rights of the child? We end up with traditional Christian sexual ethics. So the good, the great good that Christian sexual ethics protects is the rights of children to relationship with their parents, and to identity, to knowing who they are. Those are the great goods that are protected by traditional Christian sexual morality. In other words, we can deduce that the church has been right all along. The church has been right all along. Now, some people may balk over this concept because they may think to themselves, well, what about contraception? Why can't we have sex as long as we contracept? So what we have to do in order to answer that question is ask ourselves, what happens if your contraception fails? What are your options if your contraception fails? The first option might be that you get married and raise the child together for a lifetime, and you just forget about the fact that you started by having sex outside of marriage. And this used to be called the shotgun wedding. The idea of a shotgun wedding is so countercultural today that if you go on Google and you look for an image, and I did this once, I wanted to have an image of a shotgun wedding, the grandpa standing on the porch with a shotgun, making the guy marry his daughter and so on and so forth. If you go look for an shotgun wedding and type that into Google Images, you will come up with images of babes carrying guns, scantily clad women holding guns. That's what comes up. The concept is not even understood that you might actually get married in order to protect the interests of the child and having a relationship with both parents is completely lost culturally. So the second option you might have is that both parents relinquish their parental rights and place the child for adoption. Now, this preserves the right of the child to have two parents who are married to each other, but obviously the relationship between the child and their natural parent has been severed by that process. Another possibility is that one parent raises the child alone with limited and, we must say, uncertain contact with the other parent, because that's pretty much how that goes down. A lot of you have probably had experience with unmarried parenthood where it was unmarried from the beginning. You have all good intentions, perhaps, that the other parent's going to be involved, but seldom does it work out for a lifetime that relationship is stable. And the final option that you have in the event of contraceptive failure is you can abort the child. That's the other option that you have. So all of these options, I would suggest to you, all of these options are in some way or another unjust to the child. All of these options damage the child's natural interest and natural right in a relationship, a stable relationship with both of their natural parents. And that is why contraception doesn't really bail you out. Okay, the idea that contraception is somehow going to change the calculus and so on, that's not really true. And if we ask ourselves, well, how often does contraception fail? I could speak about this for a long time, and I have in other presentations, but on average, if you have 100 women using contraception at random for a year, at the end of a year, 10 of those 100 women will be pregnant. And that's kind of overall. And there are a lot of differences that vary according to the contraceptive method you're using, the age of the person, their marital status, and so on and so forth. But I'm not going to go through all of that now. But that information is certainly well available, and it's well known even to the people who promote contraception. They are well aware that contraception fails, and they're well aware that it is more likely to fail for the young, the unmarried, and the poor. They're well aware of those facts. And so I would suggest to you that Catholic sexual morality saying, contraception doesn't really buy you anything, that's actually the more sensible position to be taking with respect to the rights of the child. The second point that we want to discuss is how we want to understand the sexual revolution and how it has affected children. So the sexual revolution has been going on my whole lifetime, and many people watching this video have never known anything but the sexual revolution and its impact on society. So I want to analyze and break down the sexual revolution, exactly what it is. The way I analyze it and express it, there are three parts to the sexual revolution. And I think this structure is helpful for understanding what's going on, because sometimes it can feel overwhelming. There's so many new and crazy things going on that it's helpful to be able to break it down into some component parts. So the basic idea is this, that a good and decent society should do three things. First, a good and decent society should do everything possible to separate sex from babies. And that is what I call the contraceptive ideology, that we ought to separate sex from babies. Secondly, a good and decent society should separate both sex and babies from marriage. In other words, it's not necessary to be married in order to have sex. It's not necessary to be married in order to have a child. I call that the divorce ideology. And thirdly, it's necessary, a good and decent society should wipe out all differences between men and women except for those differences that the individual explicitly chooses to bear. And I refer to that as the gender ideology. And this is approximately what Pope Francis means when he's talking about the gender ideology. You may have heard him speak about this and use that terminology. I think he and I are talking about more or less the same things. So just for your information, I have much more information about each one of these three aspects of the sexual revolution, and you can get more information later. So let's break it down and speak just briefly about the contraceptive ideology, just say a few words about each one of these three ideologies. What the contraceptive ideology does is it creates the idea that sex is normally and usually a sterile activity. Babies are thrown in as an afterthought if you happen to have quirky lifestyle preferences. But you're entitled pretty much to a lifetime of unlimited, problem-free, child-free, guilt-free sex. That's what the contraceptive ideology is meant to provide for people. And I have up on the screen images of a couple of people who have lived that way. Harvey Weinstein, Theodore McCarrick. These are people who were full-on sexual predators who honestly believed they were entitled. And when you really think about the idea of being entitled, it's kind of, well, who really thinks that? Who actually really thinks they're entitled to sex? Well, the predator. This is an ideology that benefits predators, not the potential prey. We can think about the prophetic voice of Pope St. John Paul VI in Humana Vitae. Of all the things that are in Humana Vitae, most of it, of course, and this is the famous birth control encyclical, so-called birth control encyclical that came out in 1968. And much of it, of course, is theology and church teaching and so on. But there's a very famous passage, number 17, where he simply lays out the likely consequences of normalizing the use of contraception. And he lists these items: increase in marital infidelity, lowering moral standards, lowering incentives to avoid temptation, reduced respect for women. And finally, and most ominously, he says in 1968, in item 17 of Humana Vitae, he said, if this is considered an okay thing for people to do, governments will decide that it's okay for them to impose it on their people. And at that point, it hadn't been happening, but now we know, of course, that all of that had happened. And so we can say, without hesitation, I think, that Pope St. Paul was prophetic. And this is a little image the image that's on the screen is something that circulated during the 50th anniversary year of Humana Vitae. All right, so moving on from the contraceptive ideology, let's talk briefly about the divorce ideology, the idea that we should separate both sex and babies from marriage. Now, again, I'd like to look at this from the child's perspective. We're supposed to refer to these things as alternative family forms. We're not supposed to say broken families, right? We're supposed to talk about alternative family forms. And let's just start with divorce, because in a way that's the least bad of the alternatives, you know? The parents were at one time married to each other. The parents at one time intended to stay together for their sake of their children and their family and so on. What do we typically hear people say when they have a divorce, when divorce happens? In fact, there are little books that tell you, here's how you tell your child you're about to get divorced. And what these books will tell you, and some of you may have heard this, some of you may have seen this, some of you may have had it said to you when you were a child. Mommy and Daddy are getting divorced. We still love you, honey. We just don't love each other anymore. And so there are going to be a few changes in your life. But we still love you. All right, now you're a child, and you're 5, 10 years old, whatever it is, and you hear this. And you can't, of course, you can't think this all through because you're a little kid. But in the child's mind, from the child's perspective, mommy is half of who I am. Daddy is half of who I am. You're sitting there saying, you love me, but you don't love half of who I am? How does that even work? See, the truth is, it doesn't even really work. And we're leaving the child to figure this out on their own, to handle it on their own. If they have problems, we take them for therapy. If they have problems, we put them on medication. And let me list some of the kinds of things that children see and experience. And I share this with you based on the testimony of a dear friend of mine who at one time worked for the Ruth Institute, and she's the one who clued me into all of this and how difficult it really can be for children. Her parents got divorced when she was very small. Her mother remarried, and in her new marriage, she had a child with her new husband. And so every week, my friend would go from her mom's house to her dad's house and back again. She did that. But while she's sitting there in the driveway waiting for her dad to come pick her up, she's realizing that her half-sister gets to stay home the whole time. Her half-sister gets to have a whole dad, and she has two half-dads. And it's really not equal. It's not the same thing at all from the child's perspective. And yet we're telling them that it's all the same, it's all good, it's going to be fine. That's how we're treating them. We're expecting them to manage it. When they're going back and forth, they may notice that at their mom's house, there are no photos of her dad. There are no photos of her dad's side of the family. And when she's at her dad's house, no photos of mom. No photos of mom's side of the family. But her half-sister in her home gets to have her whole family tree right up there on the wall. It's very unequal. And I'm telling you, the photos, the things I hear from children of divorce about photos and how hard this is, it's not unheard of for somebody to go cut the photos out of the, wipe out the spouse they're divorcing and take them out of all the family albums. It's not unusual for an adult child of divorce to tell me, I have 2 pictures of myself with both parents. I have 2 pictures. Okay, this is what we're doing to children. Now, I submit that this is unjust, and this accounts for some of the problems that we observe among children of divorce. Now, on the screen right now, I have a chart that shows some of the problems that children of divorce experience. All right, and this is based on sociological studies, data that's been collected and gathered and analyzed over the past 40 or 50 years. A lot of this analysis has been done. And what you'll see is a combination of academic problems, health problems, psychological problems. And sometimes you'll hear people say, the reason we should support lifelong married love is because this is the best environment for kids and kids do best. And that's true, but that's not enough. What I want to say is that the reason kids do best is because that is the environment which is truly just for them. And when they're in an environment that is pushing them back and forth and making these kind of psychological demands upon them, that's why they're having all these problems. It's the fundamental injustice of the thing that's generating all of these negative outcomes for children that you'll sometimes hear people talk about. But just to show you that this is a real thing, one of my colleagues, Dr. Pat Fagan, has written an article called The Effects of Divorce on Children, and it goes through one after another of the kinds of problems children experience for 40 closely typed pages and 333 footnotes. There is no doubt that divorce is hard on children. And so if you ever hear people say, kids are resilient, the kids will get over it, the kids will be fine, that is simply untrue. That is not true. And you don't have to believe it. And if you yourself are a child of divorce, I want you to know that I know that it was hard. And I'm here for you. And the church is here for you because it was hard. And it still is hard for a lot of you. I want to go on to mention another part of the divorce ideology, which is the whole concept of the donor-conceived person and some of the concerns, the very real concerns that donor-conceived persons have. And what I mean by a donor-conceived person is this is a person who perhaps their mother purchased the use of sperm, perhaps their father purchased an egg and a surrogate, and the services of a surrogate, but half of their identity is wrapped up in an anonymous gamete, okay? And their parent may be married to another person, but the person who is acting as their social and legal father, for example, was not the biological father. So I just want to list for you some of the problems that those people will tell you about. They're confused about who they are. They're confused about their identity. They want to know why they look different from the other members of the family. They're angry about the secrecy that often takes place because sometimes people, kind of hush it up and so on and so forth. They'll pick a donor that looks like the dad or something, so that they can go through the fiction that this is the same, that there is no donor and so on. They're sometimes ashamed at the thought that they were partially purchased and that their father, for example, accepted $200 in exchange for agreeing to never have anything to do with them again. Because that's what you do when you masturbate into a jar and you leave it with the sperm bank. You're agreeing that you're never going to have a connection with that person. That's part of the deal, okay? And so that is very painful to the child from the child's perspective. Sometimes they are concerned about encountering missing half-siblings. This is very strange, and sometimes you hear about this in the news now, and it's sometimes presented like it's a sensational, crazy thing. But from the child's perspective, it's very real. I once encountered a young man who was a donor-conceived person, and he was able to find out the identity of his father. It turned out that his father had donated sperm once a month for the 10 years that he was working his way through medical school. And so this young man came to the conclusion that it was possible that he had as many as 500 half-siblings. And so he eventually moved away from that community because he was seeing people who looked strangely like himself, and it was freaking him out. So most people don't have to worry about that kind of thing. But this is when we separate marriage from procreation, this is the kind of issue that we get into. And of course, it's very common for the donor-conceived person to long for that missing parent and to want to know who they are. There are some larger ethical concerns about third-party reproduction. The way that we are commodifying people, the way that we're turning the sperm and the egg and ultimately the person themselves into a kind of commodity. There's a very real concern about the exploitation of the young and the weak and the poor by the old, the strong, and the rich who can buy all of these services. And so what we have come to, in a way, is that the child is a problem to dispose of if you don't want one, that's the abortion mentality, or an object to purchase if you do want one, which is the third-party reproduction mentality. And I would submit to you that neither of these are consistent with the dignity of the child. Finally, let's deal with the gender ideology. A good and decent society should do everything possible to wipe out all differences between men and women, except for those that the individuals specifically choose to bear. Now, and we call this the gender ideology. At one time, you could say that feminism, the kind of feminism that I grew up with in college and so on, was a forerunner of the gender ideology, because I was taught, and maybe some of you were too, that men and women are completely the same, and therefore, all the differences you see are all socially constructed. Therefore, we should be able to wipe out all differences between men and women. If you feel anything or experience anything different, you put that aside. Just don't even think about that. And so the original form of gender ideology was looking for a kind of sameness or equality between men and women, to the extent that things that were gender specific were in some ways, in some cases, prohibited. So it's not unusual that father-daughter dances would be banned as being unlawful sex stereotyping. That happened, that does happen, that still happens. But it is now morphed from banning father-daughter dances to requiring gender-neutral bathrooms. The movement of the whole gender ideology has been from that old style of feminism to what we would now call transgenderism. And a lot of times people will say to me, Dr. Morse, how did this happen so fast? It seems like it just came out of nowhere, that all of a sudden we're talking about transgenderism and transitioning and gender-neutral bathrooms. Where did this all come from? And what I want to say about that, and of course we could talk about this a long time, but just briefly, this did not just come out of nowhere. They didn't just sneak up on us. They have been working on degendering everybody for a long time. And part of the degendering is to say, go ahead and postpone childbearing, ladies. You know, you can put it off. If a man can put it off, you can put it off. It'll be fine. We, as women, were expected in some ways, if we were professional women, we're expected to kind of apologize for motherhood. When I was a little, and I'll just tell you, this will reveal my age, I suppose, but when I was a little girl, it was perfectly okay for me to say, I want to be a mommy when I grow up. By the time I got to college, that was no longer okay to say, yeah, I want to be a mom, but but I really want to be a college professor. You know, it was not okay to just say that this is going to be my primary vocation. Men are expected to be assistant moms rather than actual dads. We have no concept anymore of what a father actually does. And masculinity is in some cases considered toxic. That's a whole thing that we're dealing with now. And I think one of the saddest of all is that little boys are expected to sit still in school, which is absolutely ridiculous and tragic. And whenever I have a grade school teacher in the audience, you'll see them nodding in agreement that it's crazy to think that a little boy and a little girl are going to behave in the same manner in a classroom. That's completely not true. So where the gender ideology has now taken us, of course, is to full-on transgenderism, where it's not just that we're going to socially deconstruct the sex of the body, we're going to personally and individually deconstruct the sex of the body, and if I want to become a man, I can become a man. And this image that I have here of Bruce Jenner on the cover of Vanity Fair has become a classic image. Everybody has seen it, whether you want to or not. Everybody has seen this image. What I would like to simply point out to you is the stereotypical view of what it means to be a woman. If you look at that image, and you look at how he has chosen to present himself as a woman, personally, I don't dress like that. About half of this audience is women, and nobody's dressed like that. Nobody out here is dressed like that. That's not a normal presentation of femininity. This is what some man thinks is the ideal of womanhood, or something, right? So, but it's a very stereotypical view of what it means to be a woman, which completely contradicts the earlier view that we were supposed to get beyond stereotypes, okay? So there's just one problem with the sexual revolution. We're supposed to separate sex from babies, but sex actually does make babies. Everybody agree with that? Sex actually does make babies. Secondly, we're supposed to separate sex and babies from marriage because the kids will be fine, it's not really important, but actually kids do need their parents. They need both of their parents. They need their parents to love each other. And finally, we're supposed to wipe out all differences between men and women except for those explicitly chosen by the individuals, because the body isn't really very important and we can override everything about the body at our whim. But actually, the body matters. Men and women really are different and the body is significant. Okay? That is to say, the sexual revolution is completely irrational. It is impossible. We have elite members of society, including the government, academia, law, media, all committed to bringing about a world that cannot be. You cannot make a world where sex doesn't make babies and where men or women are completely interchangeable, and you certainly cannot make a world where children don't need their parents. Therefore, it doesn't mean this thing's going to collapse because it's crazy. It cannot stand on its own, and this is the key to understanding the whole thing. It cannot stand on its own. The sexual revolution requires a lot of force, and it requires a lot of propaganda to keep it ticking, to keep it humming along. It requires a lot of force. And for some people, this is precisely the appeal, because there's a lot of power involved here. And let me put it to you this way. If you can convince people that Bruce Jenner is a woman, you can convince them of anything. If you can make people say that the 1976 decathlon Olympic winner is really a woman and always has been a woman, if you can make them say that, you can make them say anything. And that's the point. Power is the point of the thing. And that is why I say that the sexual revolution is a totalitarian ideology that no Christian should have anything to do with. We've been tap dancing around this thing for way too long. In fact, I would call it a fantasy ideology. A fantasy ideology. And it's beyond left and right. I think it's a mistake to just say it's a left-wing thing or something like that. Because it's comparable to other kinds of fantasy ideologies in that it grants ever-increasing amounts of power to the subset of people who are already in power. Right? To an elite class, it gets more power. It is completely oblivious and impervious to anything, any evidence, any proof that contradicts the reality, and you got to suppress all that. You got to tamp all that down. And finally, of course, it's intolerant of dissent. You can't have people going around saying that it's really, really kids actually do need their parents, and actually contraception doesn't really help women all that much. You can't have these little sisters of the poor running around not covering contraception at zero cost to all their employees. I mean, those dissenters, we can't have that, right? Because the ideology is an intellectual house of cards. It is very fragile, and that's why they got to do this. The sexual revolution resents the basic facts of the human condition. The contraceptive ideology resents the fact that sex makes babies. The divorce ideology resents the fact that children need their own biological parents and not just a pair of hands. They need personal relationship with their parents. And finally, the gender ideology deeply resents the fact that men and women are different. This is an ideology that is in open conflict with human embodiment. In other words, this is a modern form of Gnosticism, resenting the limitations of the human body and powered by secret knowledge available only to the elite class. This is a form of Gnosticism. So let's turn now to talk about the guilty conscience problem, because we've analyzed the sexual revolution. We've analyzed how traditional Catholic sexual morality protects the interests of children. We've got a problem, though. The problem is, why is it that so many people are unable to receive our testimony about this? Why is it so hard to get people to listen to what we have to say when it seems so obvious? And I think the answer is a guilty conscience. And let me explain this. Before I do, though, I want you to notice that this is a theological answer. We're supposed to be beyond theology. We're supposed to be beyond all that sky god stuff, okay? But in fact, the answer to the crucial question of our time is really a theological question, a theological answer. So here's the next question. How do I know all about the guilty conscience? The answer is, I did a lot of these things. I did a lot of these crazy things. I lived with my husband before we were married. I had an abortion. I had a divorce. I've done all these crazy harebrained things. So I know from experience, I know that it doesn't work. I know the pain of it. And I know the confusion that you get yourself into because you're trying to talk yourself into making it okay, and it's not okay. And the more you talk yourself into it, the further away you get from the truth. And therefore you go, you kind of spiral downward. And it's not very easy to find somebody who will actually help, because a lot of them are committed to the ideology too, and so they'll tell you, oh no, it couldn't possibly have anything to do with your abortion. No, don't worry about living with your boyfriend. Just blow that off. Don't worry about it. That's not great. The reason you guys are having relationship problems has nothing to do with the fact that you're not married. But I also know that healing is possible. I also know that from experience. And I know that I would not have been healed without the love and care of Jesus Christ operating through his church and the many good and decent people I have seen, including priests and lay people alike. So we've got a serious problem here. As a culture, we've got a serious problem. If you've got a 5% divorce rate, you could say, well, those people have got something wrong with them. If you got a 5% out-of-wedlock childbearing rate, you could say there's something wrong with those people. But when you've got going on 50% of children being born out of wedlock, that's a structural problem. It's not just the fault of those individuals. There are bad public policies in place that are pushing people in the wrong direction, actively steering them away from where they need to be. It's a problem at the social structural level. We've got bad public policies that we need to deal with, but it's also a personal problem because every family in America has been affected by it. Everybody has family members who have been through this in one form or fashion. And at this point in time, I would say most people are both victims of the sexual revolution and also perpetrators in some way. Most of us have done things we shouldn't have done and have hurt people, okay? So we have to deal with that. So I've been developing the concept of the survivors of the sexual revolution. We've come up with about 12 different categories of survivors of the sexual revolution. And so if we ask ourselves, do you know any victims or survivors of the sexual revolution? You know, everybody knows somebody who's been through something like this. So if you've been involved in pro-life work, you know about the concept of the post-abortive woman. That's the woman who's had an abortion and regrets it. And she's not supposed to exist. You know, abortion's no bigger deal than pulling a tooth. So there's not supposed to be anybody like that, but you probably all know somebody who's been through that. Some people have health problems as a result of their use of contraception or their abortion or their hooking up. Children of divorce, children of unmarried parents. There are people who are reluctantly divorced, and this is a concept that we have pioneered at the Ruth Institute, to say that there are many people who would like to stay married, but under current law, they cannot stay married because their spouse wants a divorce, and that's all it takes is for one party to want the divorce. I would submit to you that those people who want to stay married and are legally not permitted to stay married, those people have been victimized by the sexual revolution as well. So a theological problem requires a theological solution. So if we're dealing with a guilty conscience, so these people, a lot of these people who have been through these experiences, they may feel bad if we sit there and say, you know, you really shouldn't do that. And Jesus says don't do it, and the church says don't do it. And it says right here in the papal encyclical, don't do that. If we approach it in that manner, we're going to lose a lot of these people. They're going to shut down. But if you understand that this is a theological problem that needs a theological solution, we have to ask ourselves, how do we manage a guilty conscience? Now, as Catholics, a lot of times people will give us a hard time because they'll talk about that Catholic guilt. You guys feel guilty about everything. Well, let's analyze that. If you do something wrong, you should feel guilty, right? If you've done something wrong, you should feel bad. That bad feeling is what is going to propel you to make amends and to do what you ought to do and to stop doing that stuff, right? So it can't be true, it simply can't be true that you never want to feel guilty. Because everybody's going to do something wrong from time to time. The question is, what are you going to do after you've done something wrong? Well, oftentimes we're told, you got to forgive yourself. You got to get over it. You got to forgive yourself for that abortion. See, the problem is we don't really have the authority to forgive ourselves. And in our heart of hearts, we know that. We know it doesn't work, right? So let me give you an example, very simple example. Let's say I stand up here and I start bad-mouthing my husband. I start saying bad things about my husband. Okay, this is clearly a sin for me to do that. And who is harmed by that sin? Well, he is. It harms my husband and his reputation, harms our children. It harms all of you getting a negative view of what married life is all about. It's harmful to the community. And of course, it's offensive to God for me to be committing that sin. So for me to say I'm going to forgive myself without attending to the fact that I've hurt other people, that's just not going to work. I need to be making amends to all of those people, including, of course, to God. I need to make amends to the children and the whole thing, okay? So that's why this thing that we often hear doesn't work. And so therefore, when people go someplace else besides the church to deal with their bad feelings, they don't really get any help. See, and they keep being told, oh, just get over it, put it aside. That doesn't help. Meantime, their wounded children, their wounded spouse is still out there, simmering, angry, upset, or whatever. The relationship has been harmed. They've done nothing to repair it. right? So you've got to take those steps that are necessary to make amends, and that's part of the process of healing your guilty conscience. Then your conscience will be at ease, at peace, if you do that. But you've got to do it. You've got to do it. Now, sometimes we hear the idea of a victimless crime. And this is a language, I want to just pause for a moment and analyze this for you, because we often hear this with reference to sexual sin, that it's okay to do this because there's no victim. It's a victimless crime, okay? What I want to say is that there is no such thing as a victimless sin. All sins have victims, and that's why I picked the example that I just did, okay? Me bad-mouthing my husband is a sinful act, but it's not a crime, right? It's not a crime. I'm not going to go to jail for it. We don't want the government monitoring whether I'm being nice to my husband. That's not a matter of the public government legal mechanism for people to be saying, you know, this is bad, so therefore we're going to get the law involved. That is a very sound judicial principle that not every sin needs to be a crime. Okay, that's a very old principle of jurisprudence. St. Thomas Aquinas would agree with that. Not every sin needs to be a crime. It's a matter of prudence what's going to be considered a crime or not a crime. And so somehow in our modern world, in our modern mind, we have kind of morphed into the idea that there is such a thing as a victimless crime, and therefore it shouldn't be a crime at all because nobody's really getting hurt. And the whole argument has been kind of stood on its head. Instead of saying that we have an obligation in charity and justice to be as kind as possible, without the law being a factor whatsoever, we have convinced ourselves that we get to do whatever we want because we've redefined who counts as a victim and who doesn't count as a victim. So I would say to you that we as Catholics have something unique to offer the problem of the guilty conscience, which is that we can give people a coherent account of what you do when you've done something wrong. You don't drop off the face of the earth. It's not the end of the world when you do something wrong. We have a process for getting you back, and that process is called confession. And that is why we at the Ruth Institute are very active in supporting confession. Every year during Lent, we put billboards up in Lake Charles, some of which I'll put up here now, and people drive through Lake Charles and see these billboards that are making an important point, but in a humorous manner, okay? And this one, you won't really shock him. Go to confession. This poor priest, you can't imagine what some of the priests hear. But in any case, the point is, it's not the end of the world when you commit a sin, but you got to deal with it. You got to deal with it. Now, when you are dealing with a person, with a friend or something, you may be encountering the guilty conscience, and when you're encountering the guilty conscience, that is not the time to bring out your charts and graphs or your papal encyclicals. Argument is not where you need to be at that point, okay? So lots and lots of people are in this category of having a guilty conscience in some way, and that is blocking their ability to hear what you have to say. Let's now turn to our final section. What will our legacy be? This little image that I put up here sometimes makes people smile. The Catholic Church has been outlasting oppressive governments since 33 AD. We will outlast our current set of problems as well. But I want to close by pointing out to you that we have two competing worldviews at work in our society. The Catholic worldview, the view of traditional Christian sexual morality, is that every child, and hence every adult, has identity rights and relational rights with respect to their parents, and therefore, psst, listen up, this part's a secret. These rights of children impose obligations on adults, which we don't like to admit or deal with. Now, the competing worldview, the worldview of most of the governments of most advanced countries in the West, the competing worldview is that every adult has the right to the sexual activity they want with a minimum of inconvenience, and kids just have to accept whatever the adults choose to give them. And we don't say that part too loud because we'd be ashamed of ourselves if we just blurted it out like that. But that is approximately the position of most of the governments of the so-called modern West, is that kids just have to put up with whatever the adults choose to give them. As Catholics, we believe that the human person is meant for love, that the deepest truth about the human person is that we are meant for love. This beautiful quotation from John Paul II: "Man cannot live without love. He remains a being that is incomprehensible for himself. His life is senseless if love is not revealed to him, if he does not encounter love, if he does not experience it and make it his own." When we think of the human person as being meant for love, we as Catholics know that God creates every single person as an act of love. You exist because God loved you into existence. That is true of every single person. Catholics have no doubt about that whatsoever. Every single person is loved and willed by God. And God wants human participation in creation. He wouldn't have to have us procreate. That wouldn't have to be the way he did it, but that is the way he did it. It takes one man and one woman to bring into being another human person. And God wants every person to come into existence as the result of an act of love between their mother and their father. That is, God wants us to participate in his loving creative act. That is what I believe as a Catholic, and I am not ashamed to say so. I'll put that view up against any other view on offer today. Thank you very much.